Welcome to Rock and Roll Fridays, a podcast on musical encounters and life.
Welcome to Rock and Roll Fridays, and I'm so happy to have a guest. Anthony Krupe is joining me today, and Anthony is the director and producer and did most of the work on a film called Sigma Kids, which we will talk about today. Sigma Kids is about David Bowie, and I'll let Anthony introduce himself and talk a little bit about Sigma Kids, and then we'll get into it.
Hi, yes, thanks for having me. The Sigma Kids. The Sigma Kids were a group of hardcore Bowie fans from different neighborhoods of Philadelphia. And this was at a time when he wasn't this worldwide rock star that he became. This was sort of the early beginnings of his relationship with America. So it became this special, sort of unique connection between them and him. He was an artist on the rise. They were ravenous, and they still are to this day. It's my son. They really made this really cool connection that carried on throughout the years. And so this is that story.
And for those that don't know, Sigma Sound Studios was located in Philadelphia on 12th Street in Philadelphia. It was associated with Gamble and Huff, the great producers and writing artists in the Philadelphia sound and the Philadelphia soul sound. And, you know, just a little bit about the Sigma Sound Studios itself, like it's where Billy Joel played an hour-long show, which led to Captain Jack getting played on the radio in Philadelphia, which led to Billy Joel becoming a popular artist, cool. John Lennon, Luther Vandross played on the album with Bowie. So it's a lot of, as we were talking earlier, a lot of different voices and people kind of gravitated to Philadelphia to record this album. And we always talk about it on the show, whether artists are starting off or famous, when they have fans that love what they do and connect with the artists, and the artist gives back. That's always a great experience.
Yeah, exactly. And that was the element of the story that really brought me in the beginning. But as it went along, I stumbled into all of this history that you just mentioned, things that I really didn't know much about or didn't know about at all. And to know, I mean, the list goes on, like you said. And I didn't even know that Billy Joel story, like you just said. But I believe it because I know MMR had a lot of, they were right there in Center City. And so a lot of the musicians that were at Sigma would end up hanging out at MMR, and that's how they broke a lot of artists that way. It was a total history lesson for me. As I went along, I kind of thought I knew what the film was going to be about, and it worked out that way. But I also stumbled into all these other great stories.
Right.
Like you said, the history of the sound of Philadelphia that was so rich and largely untold. And it still is a little bit undertold, I think. We get into it in the film, but
that's awesome. And the actual studio is a historic site. The building is a historic site in Philadelphia. Back in the day, over 6,000 unclaimed tapes from Sigma Studios over 35 years were given to Drexel University's audio library. So you can actually, if you have the time, go and listen to the recordings of the studio. And it's awesome. I think with a lot of documentary / films like the one that you did, you probably uncovered and all the layers of not only the relationship between Bowie and the fans, but also the building itself and the recordings that happened there.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned the Drexel thing. I use a couple of the outtakes. I went there. And Toby Ciaz, who runs that department, was super cool. And he let me kind of just putz around for a day. And I mean, for any music fan, it was like it was an experience. So he let me use a few of the outtakes from the album, and they're in the film. It's the coolest thing. I legally, nobody really knew who owned it.
Right.
Technically, you know that.
Right.
So I just took a chance and threw them in there, and they really just put it over the top.
Right.
Yeah.
So talk about what is the film about? So is it a night, or is it a couple nights where fans and Bowie kind of hung out and listened to the album? Like, talk us through what the premise of the movie is.
It starts with these fans. They're these super fans, like I said, early on in Bowie's days when he's first coming over here, right after Ziggy Stardust, and he's trying to branch out and do this new thing.
So this is like 74, right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
So he does David live at the Tower.
At the Tower Theater in Philadelphia. Yeah.
And they connected with him when he was in town, just briefly, kind of like high and by on the way in and out of the hotel. But he gives them a heads up. I might be in town over the summer. If you keep an eye out, you might see me, right? So he's kind of like playing this cat and mouse game with them early on. And of course, they were on the edge of their seat, on the lookout.
Right.
And it's the old days. You can't text, you know, it's not that easy. So they went through a lot of trouble to find him. And finally, they find out where he is. He's at the hotel. He tells them, you know, he's gonna be down at Sigma Studios. They basically camped out there, and it's every night over, I think, about 2 weeks.
So how many fans are doing this roughly?
It was a group between a dozen or so at the most, but their hardcore group was like 5 or 6. And we interviewed 2 of them in the film. It's Patty and Marla, and they're kind of like the center of this community to this day. I mean, Bowie fans throughout the world know who they are.
Right.
And they you know, have various groups on social media. They have meetups in person. Like it's a real community.
And were they from the Philadelphia area originally?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Patty was from Upper Darby, so she was. She actually tells a couple cool stories about working at the Tower at the time, and you know, being around it from the beginning. And Marla was from right outside the city. So yeah, these are real Philly girls. And so they connected with him, and he was very appreciative of them. Every day he's going in and out of the studio, he's seeing them, and it's this charming story. He's sending them pizza, he's making sure they have a ride home. Like it was just the nicest thing. It's really it's a really nice story. So by the end of the week, he finishes what would kind of be like the rough cut of the album, and he goes, "We need an audience. I need to find out if what we did here, if we're on the right track," because this was a completely new sound for him. And he brings them up, and it's like this impromptu dance party, and it's just such a pure thing that really doesn't happen now. It was only, you know, it was kind of like you don't see this kind of thing now,
right?
First of all, with social media, it would have been 1,000 kids out there, but
so
it was such a small group. It was really personal. They knew each other by the end of the week. He brings them up. They have a party. They're listening to the music, and they talk about how he was really insecure about it, and he's kind of like in the corner, like not sure. He's reading their faces, trying to see what they're gonna think. Do they really like it? And that's amazing to think about now. David Bowie, this glam rock icon,
yeah.
He was insecure about it. He really didn't know. He really was truly trying to see like if these kids were going to be into it, and of course they went nuts for it. And the record ends, and it's kind of quiet, and somebody screams out, "Play it again!" And he's like, "Really?" And they play it again, and when they play it again, everybody jumps up, and it's a big party. So that's sort of like the climax of the film. It builds up to that, and it's just a really cool moment.
And how did you track down the fans? Did
It was the easiest thing in the world, actually. I literally I stumbled into that article. There was an article, I think, in the old Philly Weekly
mm-hmm.
That mentioned Patty specifically by name. And I kind of, almost kidding, I don't know. I didn't think it was really going to go anywhere, but spur of the moment found her and messaged her on Facebook. And she got right back to me. I said, what do you think about doing a film about this or something?
Right. Yeah.
I really didn't. It was half cooked idea at the time, but I just dove in and she's like, yes, let's do it. And she owns a bar in Philly, Doobies. I showed up at the bar and she
owns Doobies. Oh,
she owns Doobies.
Yeah.
To this day, Doobies is like the center of that sort of Bowie community.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so I went and I sat down and she was just like this complete open book and they love telling these stories. And I said, we got to find a way to do this.
Yeah. And how long was the process and how long did it take you to kind of get everything to the point where you're like, this is a complete?
It was a lot of stops and starts just because, again, I was kind of doing it myself. And I would be reaching out to certain people and it takes a while for them to respond, so there were a lot of delays. I mean, it took probably 4 years before I finally thought we have it. But really, it didn't have to take that long. I mean, I shot 6 interviews. We shot one day in person outside of the studio.
Awesome.
And then just editing. So really, it wasn't a huge production, but getting people scheduling things like that. It took some time.
What was one thing you were surprised to find either about the studio itself or Bowie or the fans? What was there a surprising tidbit or two that?
Yeah, definitely. One thing that I had no idea, I didn't see this coming. I had never heard this, but I thought was cool. And we go into it in the film. And I have to say, Mike Tarsia, who he's in the film, he gave us some great interviews. He just passed away. He was working at the studio. He was a young engineer. His father, Joe, was basically one of the architects of the Philly sound.
Oh, wow.
He built the studio. He was the original engineer who built that studio at Sigma Sound. And him, along with Gamble and Huff, were like the early architects of that whole sound. He's a legend. And Mike just passed away. But he gave us some incredible stories. And he talks about how Bowie came to town. He kind of had some expectations, and he's basically borrowing Black music. It's
right.
Real street R&B sound, which is what he wanted.
Yeah.
And he was really surprised and disappointed to find that the Black artists in Philly, they didn't want to work with him. Because they had their reservations for different reasons. Some were political, some was just this regional, who's this outsider kind of thing. But they were like, no, we're not doing it. So he reaches out to Carlos Alomar, who also appears in the film, who's a friend of his and was a longtime bandmate.
Guitarist, right?
Guitarist, yep, brilliant musician. And Carlos says, okay, I can do that. I'll come down. And so that's where you get a New York connection. Carlos came down with his wife, Robin, and their best friend, Luther Vandross.
Right.
So Luther ends up singing on the album as well. But that whole sort of political angle, I didn't see coming, and I thought was cool. He overcame it, but it was interesting. And then Jerry Blavitt, who appears in the film as well, he touches on it. As well. But that was a surprise. That was one of those things where
I mean, back at that time, Jerry Blavitt was very influential in the music scene in Philadelphia as well.
Absolutely.
For those who don't know, Jerry Blavitt is one of the most famous Philadelphia DJs of all time and heavily connected in the Philadelphia East Coast music scene. And you mentioned Luther Vandross early on. I mentioned John Lennon played on the album. I think he played on 2 songs. I think one was Across the Universe, Beatles song. And
So
he played
Lennon,
guitar and vocals, backing vocals.
yeah, Lennon, I believe they hooked up with Lennon when they were finishing the album in New York.
Got it.
So I don't think he was ever really at Sigma, but a ton of musicians passed through there. Everybody from Springsteen, like Springsteen made an appearance while they were recording. There's some really cool photos of that. Yeah, but Lennon, I think they hooked up with after the fact.
What was Bowie's, and it's not only Bowie, right? There, I mean, Elton John has talked about Philadelphia and his relationship with Philadelphia, and from, you know, us being Philadelphians and South Jersey, this region, it's you know, we're always looked at kind of the little guy compared to New York City and other major cities because we're so close to New York. But there's always been a musical love affair with Philadelphia, the sound, the city. Can you talk a little bit about how Bowie found out about Philadelphia or got here and kind of resonated with the city at that time?
Yeah, they talk about that. Everybody talked about that in the film. It was sort of on surface, it seems like it would be a strange match, especially at that time. The city was, it was a very gritty place. Center City, Philadelphia was,
Yeah.
you know, it was always a blue collar city, but especially Center City, it was kind of a grimy scene. And here comes Bowie, you know, flashy, dressing in drag, like, you know. Meanwhile, Rizzo is the mayor of Philadelphia. It seems like it wouldn't work, but somehow it worked.
Yep.
And you mentioned it was sort of a little brother to New York. Like, a lot of people thought that appealed to him, and he always felt like he was this outsider. So maybe he saw Philly as like this outsider kind of thing. So he never wanted to do the obvious thing, I think. So
Right. Yeah.
Philly, and when he came through here on tour, and he saw that he already had this huge following here, plus it had that soul, that grit and that soul sound that he wanted, it ended up making sense.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So talk about how people can watch the film, which is the most important thing.
Yeah, so it was this long process. We used some music in the film, so it was a question of licensing. I was trying to track down some financing to really get a big release for it. And I got to a point where it's this 5-6 year journey. I want to get it out into the world. I want people to see it. So I put it up on YouTube. It's on YouTube right now, The Sigma Kids.
Yep.
For free. Check it out. And I'm really proud of it. And I think it's such a cool story. And I was excited to get it out into the world.
Yeah. And Anthony, I appreciate your time, and I want everyone, and I will be sharing the link out on Rock and Roll Fridays, the Sigma Kids. And, you know, it's always about music and that connection between people. And that's what the film is really about. It's always about the people.
100%.
So Anthony, thank you so much for being on Rock and Roll Fridays.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Mike.
Thank you.
Take care.